It's a really interesting day today. Yeah. Did you jump out of bed this morning with a great sense of anticipation and excitement because it's Pentecost? Or was it just like a normal Sunday morning? Because it always strikes me as being quite peculiar that here we are. This is number 3 in the great festival of the church. 1 is Easter, 2 is Christmas, 3 is today. But somehow it doesn't come close the way that we deal with Easter and we deal with Christmas. It's almost like that forgotten relation. We do Pentecost, but does it really grab us in the way these are the 2 great festivals of the church normally do? It certainly doesn't grab the world, so in a sense I suppose it's something more in-house. Is it that we are frightened by this day because it deals with things which we may find confusing? You know, we can talk of things like the Toronto blessing, being baptized in the Spirit, that for some of us may be a source of confusion, rather than a day of celebration. What's today, in a sense, all about, and what does it mean for the church in the 21st century? Are we just commemorating a special event in the history of the church, or are we really asking, what does this mean for us in our here and now? And that repeated phrase in the piece that the choir sang, "Come, Holy Spirit, come," perhaps provides us with the beginning of an answer. And the passages that we heard will hopefully put some flesh onto that as we look and ask what Pentecost means for us and what challenges does it present to us as we continue walking the way of faith. And I think in a way there are signs here, and we're going to look at 3 of them. Firstly, there is the sign of adoption. My sister-in-law was a social worker, quite a senior level, and I think it was her previous job. One of her responsibilities was she was chair of the adoption panel in her local authority. And it was a huge burden, because there was that great responsibility to ensure that children went to the right people to ensure their nurture, growth, and all those other things, all the questions she had to ask to ensure that this was done right and proper for the benefit of the children. It was a huge, huge task. The mountain of paperwork she had to read before each meeting was quite frightening. In the ancient world, it was a bit different. You could really, in a sense, adopt who you wanted without any great fuss. So just imagine, I am looking for someone to inherit my extensive overdraft, whatever the phrase might be. I'm looking round the congregation and wondering who is the right person, and my eyes are light on Jonathan Crossley as a potential person for this, because he could be quite useful. You see, because firstly, he's not the eldest son. The family lands and family titles will go to Tim unless his father disinherits him. So Jonathan's in a position where he could be useful, so that I could now adopt him, and he, in a sense, would have equality with Ben and Fran. And if Ben and Fran annoyed me, Jonathan could become my sole heir. And I suppose then the interesting question is, if I was to adopt him, and he was there waiting for the millions to inherit in years to come, what would he call me? And in a sense, what would he call Ron, from whom he has run away and accepted my money, rather than expecting his father to be equally generous to all his children? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because in the ancient world, this adoption was incredibly common. If you didn't have a son, you would adopt someone. If your sons were seen as being a bit fickle and worthless, you would adopt someone, in a sense, who would carry on the family line, the family name. Jonathan, if I adopted him in the ancient world, would become an Atkinson and leave behind the days of being a Crossley. That's how it was. Totally different. But for the people to whom Paul is writing, this would be known. This phrase adoption wouldn't have the resonance it has for us, but they would understand here was someone being brought into the family and given equal rights with those who are of the bloodline or others who may have been adopted into the family. And the sign of adoption is that God becomes Abba, Father. And we need to pause with that word Abba, because it's a really important word. Because it suggests an intimacy of relationship. It's much more than father. It's much closer to daddy, to that image of small child and father, and the language that's used there. This is really exciting information for the people who are hearing it. Because it's saying to them, this in a way is an ideal relationship. This is something that you need to buy into. You know, Jonathan would be at the sway of my fickle natures, whether we got tuppence or threepence by the time something happened to me. But the picture here is of becoming co-heirs with Christ. And for those who heard these words originally, they would have a huge resonance that we can only begin to imagine. Today is, of course, the birthday of the church. And in a way, it is for us a second birthday. A bit like the Queen had yesterday with the Trooping of the Colour and all those things in London. Because it, in a way, is a day when we can recognise that we are adopted into God's family. We are co-heirs. And we need to ponder what that means for us. What this intimate relationship is all about. What it means to be heirs. What it means to have the promise of that inheritance. You know, we will sing at the end of the service, there is a higher throne than all this world has known. That's a picture of the inheritance that we are offered, that in a way is what part of this day is all about. A new relationship. And to ask ourselves whether we are committed to that relationship. Whether we want God to move in our lives. Whether we want to pray, come, Holy Spirit, come. And wait and see what will happen. So there's something today about a sign of adoption. Secondly, there's something about a sign of potential. One of the modern trends in Bible study is what's called immersive Bible study. And this passage in Acts is a great one to do this with, where in a way you try and picture yourself there in the midst of that event. And ask yourselves how your senses respond to what's going on, what you see and smell and hear and touch and taste. So you're in the room with the disciples when the sound of this wind comes, when these tongues of fire appear on those who are gathered. And you ask yourself, what was that like? And then you follow the disciples into Jerusalem, into this unique event where they stand up and speak in languages that the assembled crowd could understand. That great long list of places that Molly read so beautifully. What must it have been like hearing Judeans and Cappadocians, Phrygians and Cretians and Arabs all being able to hear in their own language? The disciples scattered around the crowd doing their thing. What must it have been like to be involved in this unique day in human history, which in a way for us symbolizes the potential of the Holy Spirit? From its great outpouring there to encourage us to look forward into the future. This way in which the Tower of Babel was in the process of being dismantled, as a sign, in a sense, of the way in which the message of Christ was going to reach out into the world, that people were going to be spoken to in their own languages. We don't expect that we've got to go back and learn Greek and Hebrew to understand the Old and New Testament. We encounter it in English, which makes life an awful lot easier, to help us to try and understand what's going on and what this is all about. But it's not just about that one event. It's about the promises that are connected with it. So we can look into Galatians and hear the talk of the fruits of the Spirit. And we can hopefully look at our lives and see the way in which we have been changed. How our faith has transformed us to what we were to who we are now. And in the same way, we can encounter various passages where the writers speak about the gifts of the Spirit, calling people to fulfill certain roles, and hopefully we can see something of the gifts we've had and how we have used those for the benefit of the kingdom. And even as we prepare for church meeting on Wednesday night, and the call has gone out for people who would feel moved to serve as steward elders, I like to think we assume that those who are putting themselves forward are not doing so because they like the idea of being stood at the front, the power they may think it may give them, the status it may give them. They're doing it because they feel God is inviting them to take up this responsibility and discharge it in our midst in a way of humility. We don't expect them to lord it over the rest of us. Paul talks about the Spirit at work. He anticipates the way in which the Spirit has moved in the lives of God's faithful people throughout the generations. The way the Spirit is continuing to move. The way the Spirit is touching and transforming lives today. The Spirit that is there in our preaching and in our pastoral work, in music, in prayer, in what's happening in Sunday Club, in all these ways in which God is active in our midst. The Holy Spirit is not for a particular theology, it is for all. It is a sign of the dynamism that God offers to us. So thirdly, the Spirit is a sign for us. Church is a dangerous place. Let me take you back to 1985. I don't know what you were doing in 1985, but I know one Sunday night I was sat in church and the preacher was taking the service, a man called Victor Tudor, in the midst of his sermon said something like, "Hold up your banner for Christ," and I had this sickening sensation in my stomach. That was my call to ministry in a sense. And I debated this with God. And in the end, I thought I was really clever. Because I said to God, okay, I'll do this if you find me a wife. It seemed a reasonable way to my mind in those days. So I went off to my first teaching job. I completed my local preacher studies. I candidated for ministry. I got through, and I can remember the day that the envelope came through the letterbox saying, "Dear Richard, you've been accepted." And that sense of fear and joy mingled together. And then towards the end of the day, suddenly remembering this promise I'd bartered with God that a wife would appear, and there was no one on the horizon. Until they put my job up for interview, and my head of history that I was teaching said to me, "Oh, there's a Methodist coming for this job." And on the 24th of May, 1990, 24th of May, of course, is John Wesley's Warmed Heart Day, his conversion experience. On the 24th of May, 1990, this vision walked into the school staff room. Blue suit, white blouse, chunky bracelet round her neck. And so then, it's a bit difficult when you're going off to the north of England and she's staying in Kent, but we began this conversation and I suppose romance began to blossom. And I remember saying to God, is this the one? And I was walking past a shop window. And in this shop window was a chair. Now, Louise's maiden name is Boughton. Or if you come from parts of the country, they call it Boughton. But Boughton or Boughton. And there was this chair that was called a Boughton chair. I'd never seen one since. And I'd never saw one before. But there it was in the shop window. And it was like a revelation. Realizing, for this poor woman, I was her future. But it was a sense, for me at least, of the Spirit at work. Not coincidence, but something important. Which brings us back to the words with which Peter addressed the crowd. And he draws from the prophecy of Joel in the Old Testament. A prophecy about which we really know nothing because we can't really date it. There's nothing that says when Joel was about. So your guess is as good as mine in a way. But there's this fantastic image of the old and the young dreaming dreams and seeing visions. The Spirit being at work. The embodiment, in a way, of that great prayer, come, Holy Spirit, come. It's Peter saying to the crowd, the Spirit is here. Now, together, let's unlock its potential. So this suggests to us, if we want to see growth, individually and collectively, we need the Spirit. If we want to see love blossom in our midst, we need the Spirit. If we want to see transformation occurring in the midst of our community, we need the Holy Spirit, the fruits and the gifts that the Spirit offers. And so this great prayer, come, Holy Spirit, come, is as relevant now as it has been throughout Christian history. It is us inviting and invoking the dynamism of God. Now, we may, in a sense, have concerns about things like people speaking in tongues or whatever it may be. But this is actually part of the promise that God will allow his Holy Spirit to be at work and active in our midst. And we don't need to worry, in a sense, what that's going to be like. We just need to believe it's going to make our communal, collective, and individual lives better. Because God, by his Spirit, will be seen in our midst. So to pray, come, Holy Spirit, come, is inviting the potential of God to take this worshipping community and take us on a journey. Now that may be to somewhere totally new and hugely different, or it may just be a continuation of what's happening. We don't know. It's not about where we want to go. It's about where God is equipping us to journey. Whether we are young or old, whether our faith is solid or is fragile, here is this invitation to remember the importance of inviting God on our journey. Remembering that the Spirit he promises, that brings into this new relationship, that adopts us, is not about an event that's happened, overdone with. It's about a growing relationship and our willingness to risk saying to God, here I am. In a moment or two, we're going to sing a hymn by Brian Wren, in which there are a number of repeated phrases. And the two, in a way, that I think are really important in here. We will sing, praise the love that Christ revealed. And then in alternate verses, we will sing, live tomorrow's life today. And I love that phrase, live tomorrow's life today. Because tomorrow, of course, speaks of eternity. When we will know Christ, when we will understand the Holy Spirit, when we will get the whole picture. But Brian Wren says, just by praying, come Holy Spirit, come, we have the potential to see more of God's activity, to see more of wonders in our midst, to see more of God's potential. And the simple way for us to allow that is with humility and with courage and confidence to dare to pray, come, Holy Spirit, come. And wait and see what God will do in our midst. As one hymn puts it, O breath of life, come sweeping through us. Renew your church with life and power. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Let's have the audacity to pray those words, to wait on God and play our part in his transforming of us, of our community, of our town, and of our world. Amen.